Hello, everyone. So glad you could be here. I am going to be doing something vaguely rude, which is looking at my electronic device, and that's because all my notes are on them. So I apologize in advance. You all know Bernie Kerik, I'm sure. He was one of the two law enforcement heroes, I would argue, during 9/11. He was head of NYPD, and he and Mayor Giuliani really sort of took the city of New York and lifted us after we were brought to our knees in that terrible terrorism act. President Bush, as you may recall, picked him to be Homeland Security leader, and as former New York City Police Commissioner, Bernie Kerik was literally at the top of his profession, at the top of his game, and that's when it all came crashing down. And in his new book, which I have here, it's a raw, sort of gripping account of going from jailer to jailed. And it's the journey from correction and police commissioner to inmate number 84888-054. Commissioner, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So let's start with that number. Will you ever forget that number?
No, I won't forget it. It's basically your identity is taken away from you as a human being, and you are given a number, and that number is everything you do within the prison system. It's based around that number, so you don't forget the number.
And I know that before you were NYPD commissioner, you were also head of Rikers Island, which is, you know, at the time was known for a lot of egregious examples of bad, you know, jailing.
I took over Rikers Island in 1995. When I actually moved in there, we averaged 150 stabbings per month. It was the most violent and mismanaged jail and prison system in the nation. I had 133,000 inmate admissions per year. 22,000 was our average daily population, and ran about $1 billion budget. In 6 years that I had that agency, I took it from the most worst violent system in the country and created an international model for efficiency, accountability, and safety. And to give you an example, we went from 150 stabbings and slashings per month. On the month I became police commissioner in August of 2000, we had 1.
That's extraordinary. So you have seen the criminal justice system from that perspective as a jailer, literally, but without retrying your case, you ended up having a different perspective, and that is of someone who was serving time behind bars. Again, without retrying the details of the case, give us a sense of, speaking of accountability, sort of what charges you faced, what you were convicted of, and how much of it you think, you know, was government overreach, prosecutorial overreach, and how much of it was you did bad things?
In December of 2004, I was nominated by the president to take over Homeland Security. A week after that nomination, I withdrew my name from consideration because I had a nanny, a domestic servant that my wife and I had paid cash to. It's done around the country, all over the country, but the reality is it's illegal. You're supposed to pay payroll tax on your nanny. I did not. I chose to withdraw my name from consideration, and that led to 5 years of state and federal investigations. Ultimately, in 2009, I pled guilty to 8 felony counts, many of which had to do with my nanny, and they were false statements and tax charges.
But some of it also had to do with work that had been done, contracting work that had been done.
Yeah, I had an apartment up in the Bronx that I had work on. I paid the contractor. The government said I didn't pay enough, and therefore there was charges relating to that as well. And I've made mistakes, as everyone does. In my case, I honestly believe, and I talk about this a lot in the book, I believe that the mistakes I made could have been handled differently. They could have been handled civilly or ethically. In fact, in the Bronx, district attorney's 18-month grand jury investigation, they had determined that these were ethics violations. The federal government came in later and chose to take them criminal after I had already paid close to about $250,000 fine. And that led to my prison sentence of 48 months.
So you're looking at federal jail time. Tell me what you learned from the time that you served behind bars.
I put a lot of people in prison. Bad people that did bad things. People that tried to kill me. People that killed men I worked with. People that I seized tons of cocaine from and millions in drug proceeds. I brought cop killers to justice. I brought terrorists to justice. And I've done this for a long time, 35 years. And then I went to prison. I went to federal prison. I walked into a minimum security prison camp in Cumberland, Maryland. And I taught a life lessons class. And in that class, I had a young black man come into the class. He was 19 years old. I asked him what his charges were and how much time he got. He got 10 years, 19 years old. He got 10 years for a first-time, low-level, nonviolent drug offense. 10 years. He had never had any problems with the law before. And I think that was the beginning of my education of the real federal criminal justice system. But that wasn't one of the first things that bothered me. I was actually housed with commercial fishermen that caught too many fish. And what I didn't know is that things like that, on a regulatory scale, we put people in prison. Commercial fishermen that catch too many fish, they catch the wrong size fish. They catch a fish in one set of waters and move it to another. These, in my opinion, these are regulatory issues. They should be dealt with like regulatory issues and not crimes. So we take these people, these young first-time nonviolent drug offenders, we take these white-collar crimes, we take these regulatory things, turn them into crimes, and I come to realize quickly that we have thousands upon thousands of people in prison around the country today that didn't need prison to learn from their mistakes or pay for their mistakes. And I learned a lot more, but those are some of the most important things I learned.
We often talk about paying one's debt to society. What happens to these young prisoners, these 19-year-old men who then come out of prison and still face, an uphill climb?
Okay, the cliche of paying your debt to society, that never happens. A convicted felon never pays his debt to society, never. The debt is eternal. It lasts forever. The founding fathers of this country created a justice system where the punishment is supposed to fit the crime, and it doesn't work like that. If you're convicted of a felony and you're sentenced to probation and you never do a day in jail, the collateral consequence of that conviction lasts with you until the day you die. If you live to be 120, it goes on forever. Because
you can't get certain jobs, you don't qualify for certain programs.
You can't get certain jobs. Your civil and constitutional rights are diminished. You can't get educational help. You can't rent an apartment. You can't vote. You can't bear arms. There's so many things that are taken away from you, and no matter how good you are after, and no matter how much time you did and how much probation you did, that stuff stays with you until they put you in the ground. And it's wrong. It's wrong. It's wrong, one, because the punishment doesn't fit the crime, but more importantly, it is dumbing down society. You are creating a permanent second-class citizen in this country. And those numbers are growing far beyond your comprehension.
Let's talk a little bit more about the impact of mass incarceration. We all know that it costs roughly $30,000, $28,000 to house a prisoner. But you talk about collateral damage, that in fact the cost is much greater than that.
Well, listen, if you go to the Justice Department, you go to any correctional setting, you ask them what is the cost for incarceration, they'll tell you $28,000 to $30,000, $50,000 in some jurisdictions. And even in New York, I remember at one point somebody said $100,000 per year. We are losing in our economy billions of dollars a year over the reported cost of incarceration. Because what happens is that commercial fisherman that has been fishing since he was 17 and he's now 60, he had a boat, and on that boat he had 6 people that worked for him. He worked, his wife worked, and he is now a convicted felon. We've taken him out of the workforce. All 6 of those people got fired. We've taken his boat. We've taken his license. He spent 18 months in prison, and now he's going to get out, and he can't get a job. He can't go back to doing what he was doing. The only thing he's ever done in his whole life, and all 6 of those other people have lost employment. So it didn't cost us $30,000 a year. It cost you, the American taxpayer, about $2 million a year for that guy to pay his punishment. And the reality is, if it was handled as a regulatory issue, suspend him. Pay a fine. Pay a double fine. Pay a triple fine. Pay anything. But don't personally and professionally annihilate someone for a regulatory issue.
So what are the other solutions? You were a reformer as a jailer. What kind of reforms would you like to see as someone who's been through the system now?
You know what, Juju? I want to cover one more thing. That low-level drug offender
Sure.
that we gave 8 to 10 years. We give him 10, he's doing 8.5. We give him 15, he's doing 12. Here's the problem. He gets no education. He gets no life improvement skills. We send him back into society as a convicted felon. Where's he going? What's he going to do? He can't get a job. And I don't really care. You know, you can give him a GED program. You can get him a master's or a bachelor's. He still can't get a job. But he has an education that most people don't understand. The education he got in prison, how to steal, lie, cheat, manipulate, con, gamble, and most importantly, he learns that a verbal altercation ends in a beatdown or a stabbing. Is that really what we want back in society? And that's what we're doing to thousands of young people.
There was a very eloquent letter in the New York Times yesterday from a prisoner at Attica. I don't know if you guys saw it in the Sunday Times. He wrote that, you know, here we are in prison and we spend 10, 12 hours a day watching TV. How difficult would it be to pipe in educational television instead of, you know, endless reality shows?
And you know what? How many of you know and have seen or heard about the Khan Academy? The Khan Academy teaches millions of people all over the world on a daily basis. Yet we have 2.5 million prisoners in the United States of America today, most of which don't have access to that teaching. How is that possible? How is it possible? Why isn't it possible?
In your book, From Jailed to Jailer to Jailed, you quote a fellow inmate who called life in prison, quote, dying with your eyes open.
There was a young man that I was with in Cumberland, Maryland. His name was Eric Ring. And I was talking to him about what it had been like for him. He had 2 jobs. He got picked up on a first-time, low-level drug offense. He lost his 2 jobs, lost his house, lost his cars. And as he was coming into prison, his wife was diagnosed with cancer. That young man, there was nothing he could do for his family. He had no income. They had no income. He had 2 children, if I recall correctly. And I said to him, I said, how are you dealing with this? And he basically stared at me, and he looked down at the floor, and he said, this is like dying with your eyes open. And I have to tell you, if before I went to prison, I wouldn't get it. I wouldn't understand it. But the reality is that's what it's like. You live in a world, you are placed in an environment where your whole world around you goes on without you in it. I experienced deaths. My brother-in-law died. My son is a cop in Newark, New Jersey. His partner and one of his closest friends was shot and killed while I was in prison. No matter what the family tragedy is, there's nothing you can do but sit on the other end of the phone and listen to it, because your whole world goes on without you in it.
You speak very candidly in your book about feelings of betrayal. Mayor Giuliani being point in fact. The idea that you were so close, and in many ways you felt like he turned his back on you.
You know what, first of all, the Giuliani thing is a very small portion of the book. The mayor and I are very close. We're very close. When you come close to death with someone, you grow a bond that a lot of people wouldn't understand. I worked for him for a long time. I have an enormous amount of respect for what he did for this city, especially in the aftermath of 9/11. But he's also the godfather of my two youngest daughters. And I understand the distance. We agreed upon distance in the early days of my investigation and prosecution. We stayed apart from each other. But after my conviction, after I went to prison, I would have hoped that he would have sort of been there to help my family, or at least look after my kids, and that didn't happen. And it was disappointing. That's all.
We're already at 17 minutes or so, according to my watch. I want to take a moment to take questions from you guys here, from people online as well. Talk a little about why you wanted to get into law enforcement. I know you grew up sort of on the mean streets of Paterson, New Jersey.
I was born in Newark, New Jersey. I was raised in Paterson. I don't know how many of you have seen the major motion picture Lean on Me with Joe Clark in Eastside High School. I went to that high school. I had a pretty rough upbringing. My mother abandoned me when I was 3. She was murdered when I was 9. And I had a rough life as a child. And at some point in time, I got into the martial arts at 13. I got my black belt at 16. And I went in the military. And I think between the martial arts and the military, I became a military police officer. That's where it started to turn my life around. And one thing led to another, and my career took off.
There's a question here.
Hello. Over the last couple of years, there's been a couple stories about how a lot of the jails are becoming privatized, and how government is handing it off to a lot of private organizations, whether building it or even organizing it. And there's been some stories where there's been some people in the judicial system that have been getting money under the table and financially benefiting from putting people in jail in these private jails. Can you talk about that for a second, and how maybe if we're going to continue this trek of seeing jails be privatized, are we able to really make any real major changes in working with inmates and actually having an impact if these companies are going to be making millions of dollars off these guys?
If they're motivated by profit.
Okay.
Great question.
It's a great question, and it's not millions of dollars. It's billions. The correction industry is an $80 billion industry. I don't have any problem with private prisons at the lowest level. Minimum security, and that's it. Low security, medium, high, max, or supermax. I think the people that we put in those private settings have to be of minimum security. Otherwise, you're going to have a dangerous environment that I don't think some of these private companies can deal with. That's number one. Number two, however, in that minimum security setting, there should be a mandate. You get a privatized contract only if you can do it cheaper than the government, and only if you have programs that reduce recidivism. If you can guarantee me, if I ran Rikers, I would hand out a private contract in a minimum security setting if you guarantee me that the inmates that leave your institution never come back. You do that, or make sure the recidivism rate is reduced, that's okay. But here's not what's okay, and this happened actually a couple years ago, around the time some of that stuff was going on that you're talking about. There was a company in this country that put out proposals to state governments all across the nation and said, we want to take your prisoners, we will do it better and we will do it cheaper, but you have to do two things. And one of those two things was, you have to guarantee us a 90% occupancy rate. How's that possible? If I ran Rikers and I guaranteed someone that I was giving them a 90% occupancy rate, the only way I could do that guaranteed is violate the law. I'd have to make sure that people stayed in as long as possible. I'd have to hold them in once they were there. I'd have to violate their privileges. I'd have to violate their probation. How can I guarantee I'm going to keep a facility full at a 90% occupancy rate? I can't. I don't have ESP. I don't know what the crime rate's going to be or who's going to come and go. I can't do that. It's impossible. And that's what they were asking for.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
I have a two-part. First, with this new body of knowledge that you have any jails reached out to you for, consulting or any way to use this information to do some good? And second, as a citizen, as a voter, is there anything we can do to change some of these awful things?
The first question is, anybody reached out to me? No, and I think that may not be as easy as it sounds because I'm a convicted felon.
Would you be precluded from working for government contracting?
You're not precluded necessarily, but the bottom line is, that cloud it just keeps people away from you. On the other front, what can people do? American Coalition for Criminal Justice Reform. It's an organization I just founded. ACCJR.org. Here's what you can do. You can read this book. You can learn what the system's flaws and failures are. You can make sure other people read the book, but most importantly, then you can go to your legislators on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. And for the first time in this country's history, we now have a bipartisan issue where everybody's coming together talking about it. Stop talking. Fix it. And the legislators can fix this. There's thousands of advocacy groups working on criminal justice reform. This has to be addressed politically.
What do you think is the strongest pivot point? Is it sentencing reform? Is it policing reform? What is it?
Most importantly, I think there's three primary issues in the overall system. Sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums have to change, be repealed, revamped, or just eliminated. Alternatives to incarceration, real programs in education, and lastly and most importantly, when somebody pays their debt to society, you have to end the conviction. You have to get it off their record, because if you don't, we're going to create an environment where we have an absolute second-class citizen.
But let me ask you the devil's advocate question, which is there are a lot of victims' rights advocates who would say, there's a child molester in my neighborhood, if there's a sex offender in my neighborhood, I would like to know.
Well, I would like to know too. I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about violent prisoners. I'm talking about, and listen, how many of you have seen Lockup? You've seen Lockup on TV, you watched the show Lockup. One of the first lockups, if not the first, was done on me in Rikers Island. What you see on Lockup is not every prison. It's about 20% of the prison population. There's 60 to 80% of the prisoners in this country that are in nonviolent, minimum, or low settings. Those aren't the people you see in Lockup. People you see in Lockup are the people you're talking about. And we have to deal with them differently. I get it. I'm not saying that there isn't a need for prison. There is. I'm not saying that people can't be held accountable. They should be. But we are taking low-level, first-time, nonviolent people, and we're turning them into convicted felons, and we're destroying their lives, their families' lives, and our economy as a whole.
Is there another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, based on what you said about your nanny, and I'm sure there's so many different people in this country that could identify with that. I mean, personally, if my life was put under a magnifying glass, I'm sure you could find some law that I've violated. Do you think there are too many police? Are we over-policed in general, even before we get to prison?
You know, Juju, you asked what could we do, or somebody asked what we could do. The one thing you could do, ask your legislators to sum up all the laws on the books. Ask them how many there are. Ask them where they are. The reality is they will tell you this, they don't know. They can't tell you where all those laws are. And that's a major problem for us. The other thing is, and this is the first thing you mentioned, you see how thick that book is you have? Give me a stack of subpoenas that thick. Give me the authority, the subpoena power, and let me scrutinize you in this room and everybody in this entire building, and I promise you, I can indict you and put you in prison. Harvey Glazebrook wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day. It's one of the best books I've ever read on the system because it basically explains that any civilian, anytime, any citizen in this country commits 3 felonies a day, whether you think so, whether you agree so or not, and I don't care how good of an accountant you have, how good your lawyers are, how squeaky clean you think you are. Give me those subpoenas. I promise you, I could scrutinize you and have a really, really negative impact on your life.
Another question.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I was wondering what kind of conversations you have currently with officers in the NYPD, specifically de Blasio's relationship with the NYPD.
Well, I've been out of the police department for 14 years now. The only real conversations I have with the men and women in the NYPD now are the people that work for me then. I'm not in the government. I really have no conversations with them. And hopefully, we've seen I think we're seeing a better relationship between the PD and the mayor. I don't know what's happening. I don't talk to him, and I really have no contact with the command staff of the PD now.
But just to follow up on a very good question, what do you make of the sort of reputation of NYPD now and their relationship with not just the mayor but with the populace?
Listen,
In the wake of all the scandal.
I think you have to do two things. You have to look at the history of the NYPD and what they have done for this city historically. And as I look around this room, a lot of the people in this room and a lot of the audience here, they wouldn't remember this. But when Rudy Giuliani came into office in 1994, New York City was the most violent and mismanaged city in this country. And the reality is that over the 8 years that he was in office, violent crime was reduced by 65 to 75%, 70%. Homicide was dropped by 75%. Most of those substantial reductions in crime were in the minority communities. They've done a tremendous job at doing that. I think what's happened over the last 6 months to a year, sometimes we focus on 1, 2, 3 incidents, and then we broad brush an entire community or an entire department based on those incidents. Look at those incidents individually. I think, there's a lot to be said for what the PD does or doesn't do. I will tell you this. I don't necessarily agree with de Blasio and some of his politics, but I have an enormous amount of respect for Bill Bratton, who was a police commissioner, my police commissioner when I was a cop. Hopefully he can mend this rift that they've had over the last several months.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights, Bernie, and thanks for being here today, Commissioner, and thank you all here in person and online for joining us for this conversation. All right, have a good one.
Thank you.